The day had been a long one, the kind that settles into your bones. She'd spent most of it in a conference room with no windows, the air thick with legal arguments and the faint smell of stale coffee. The case file was heavy, both in her hands and on her mind. It involved a town upstate, a public school, and allegations of resources being unfairly diverted. It was a slow, grinding kind of injustice, the type that wears people down over years. As a lawyer for the state's Civil Rights Division, it was her job to untangle these knots. Now, driving home, the quiet of the car was a relief. The soft hiss of the tires on the wet pavement was the only sound. She had clicked off the radio, needing the silence. Her thoughts kept circling back to the case, to the boxes of documents, to the faces of the parents who had come to the office, their frustration etched deep around their eyes. She was so lost in these thoughts that she almost missed her turn onto the winding roads that led through Crestwood Hills. Crestwood Hills was one of those places. The houses were set back from the road behind tall, perfectly trimmed hedges and long driveways. You could catch glimpses of them through the trees. Big places with lots of windows, some with columns out front. The street lights here were the old-fashioned kind, casting a soft yellow glow that made the falling rain look like gold dust. It was pretty in a quiet, expensive way. She didn't come here often, but a friend had recommended a new route to avoid the construction mess on her usual highway. She was thinking about dinner, about whether she had the energy to cook or if she'd just order something, when she saw the flash of red and blue in her rear-view mirror. It was sudden, a violent burst of color against the dark, wet street. For a second, her heart did a little jump, a reflex anyone has when they see those lights. She checked her speedometer. She was going a steady 28 in a 25-mile zone. Maybe a rolling stop at that last sign? She thought she'd paused long enough, but the roads were empty, and her mind had been elsewhere. With a sigh, she signaled and pulled her sedan neatly over to the wide, clean shoulder. The rain was coming down a bit harder now, making a steady drumming sound on the roof. She put the car in park and reached for her purse, which was on the passenger seat. Her fingers found the smooth leather of her wallet. She pulled out her driver's license, then leaned over to the glove compartment. The latch clicked open, and she shuffled through the small stack of papers, the manual, a few old parking receipts, until she found the registration and proof of insurance. She placed all 3 documents together on her thigh. Then she waited. This was the part she knew. You kept your hands visible, preferably on the steering wheel. You didn't make any sudden moves. You waited for the officer to come to you. She looked in the side mirror, watching the approach. The headlights from the police car were bright, making it hard to see the figure behind them. She could just make out the shape of him getting out, adjusting his hat against the rain. He walked with a certain kind of pace, not rushed, but deliberate, authoritative. He came up on the driver's side, and she pressed the button to roll down her window. A cold, damp gust of air swept into the warm car, carrying the smell of wet asphalt and fallen leaves. "Good evening," she said, her voice calm and clear. She made sure to look at him, to be polite. The officer shone his flashlight briefly into the car. The beam swept across the interior, over her briefcase on the back seat, over her neat jacket, which was now hanging over the passenger headrest. It lingered for a half-second on her face, and then he pointed it down at the ground. "License and registration," he said. His voice was flat, without much tone to it. It was the voice of someone who had said this phrase 1,000 times. "Of course, officer," she said. She carefully picked up the documents from her leg and handed them out the window to him. Her movements were slow and obvious. "May I ask what the reason for the stop is?" He took the papers, his fingers brushing against hers briefly. He didn't answer her question right away. Instead, he looked at her license, then back at her, then at the license again. The rain pattered on his plastic-covered hat and on the shoulders of his dark jacket. "You didn't come to a complete stop back at the intersection of Maple and Ridge," he said finally, his eyes still on her license. "Just a little rolling stop." She nodded slowly. "I see. I apologize, officer. The roads are wet, and I must have misjudged it." "It was the thing you say. You don't argue on the side of the road." That's what she always told people. That's what she told herself. He grunted, a non-committal sound. He shone the flashlight back into the car, this time letting the beam rest on the back seat. "This your car?" "Yes, it is. It's leased, but it's in my name. The registration should show that." "Where are you headed tonight?" he asked. The question felt out of place. It wasn't about the stop anymore. "I'm on my way home," she said, keeping her answer simple. "Home is in Crestwood?" There was a slight edge to the question, a subtle emphasis on the name of the neighborhood. "No," she said. "I live over in the Jefferson area. I was just taking a different route home tonight." She offered a small, tight smile, hoping it would signal that this was all just a routine misunderstanding. The officer didn't smile back. He looked from her to the inside of her car, and then back out at the dark, expensive houses lining the street. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of the rain and the idle rumble of his patrol car's engine. In that silence, she felt the first tiny flicker of something else. It wasn't fear, not yet. It was recognition. It was the feeling of being measured and found to be in the wrong place. The long day, the weight of her other case, it all pressed in suddenly. This wasn't just about a rolling stop anymore. She could feel it in the way he held himself, in the cool appraisal in his eyes. He saw a black woman in a nice car, in a neighborhood where she apparently didn't belong. The profile, as they called it, was being filled in. "Step out of the car for me, please," he said. His voice had changed. It was firmer now. It wasn't a request. The flicker in her chest grew. This was the pivot point. Everything about her training, both as a lawyer and as a person who had lived this life, told her what this meant. A request to step out of the vehicle for a minor traffic violation was not standard. It was an escalation. "Officer," she said, her voice still calm but firmer now, "I haven't committed any crime that would require me to exit my vehicle. I've provided my documents. Is there a problem?" He shifted his weight. The flashlight was now pointed at her face, and she had to squint against the glare. "The problem," he said, his words clipped, "is that I need to conduct a routine check. Now, I won't ask you again. Step out of the car." The rain fell between them, a curtain of cold water. She could see his other hand resting casually on the butt of his holstered weapon. It was a posture, a message. In the distance, a car slowed as it passed, its headlights illuminating the scene for a moment before it drove on. There were witnesses now. This was happening. The long, exhausting day in the windowless room had just been a prelude. The real work was about to begin, here on the side of a rainy road in Crestwood Hills. The rain fell harder, a steady drum roll on the roof of the car. The officer's words hung in the damp air between them. Step out of the car. It wasn't a question anymore. It was an order. Inside, her mind, trained for moments of high pressure, split into two parts. One part was pure, cold logic. She knew the law. For a simple traffic infraction, an officer needed a specific reason, a reasonable suspicion of something more, to order someone out of their vehicle. A rolling stop was not enough. This was an overreach. It was, in her professional opinion, wrong. The other part was human. It was the tightness in her chest, the sudden dryness in her mouth. It was the memory of every story she'd ever heard, every case file she'd ever read that started just like this. She looked at his hand, resting on his belt near his weapon. Not a threat, but a reminder of power. She saw his eyes, hard and impatient in the reflected glow of his own headlights. She made a decision. The lawyer in her had to speak, but she had to be smarter than just right. She had to be safe. "I do not consent to a search of my vehicle, officer," she said, her voice clear and level, carrying over the sound of the rain. "And I have not done anything that would require me to get out. I have provided my license, registration, and insurance. I am happy to accept a citation if you believe I committed a violation." For a second, he just stared. It was like her calm refusal was a language he didn't understand. His jaw tightened. "I am not asking for your consent," he said, his voice rising just a notch. "I am giving you a lawful order. Exit the vehicle now." The word lawful echoed. It was the key to the whole terrible dance. If she obeyed, she was submitting to an authority she believed was acting beyond its limits. If she refused, she was disobeying, resisting. It was a trap she had studied for years, and now she was caught in its teeth. "On what specific grounds are you ordering me out of my car?" she asked. She kept her hands in plain sight on the steering wheel at 10 and 2. Every move was slow, predictable. "If this is about the stop sign, I've acknowledged it. What is the reasonable suspicion for this escalation?" He leaned down closer to the window, his face now just a foot from hers, separated by the doorframe. Rain dripped from the brim of his hat. "Lady," he said, the false politeness now completely gone, "your attitude is the problem. You're sitting here arguing instead of complying. That gives me plenty of grounds. Now this is your last chance. Get out of the car, or I will remove you." Her heart was hammering against her ribs. The attitude. It was the classic catch-all. Calmly knowing your rights was read as defiance. Professional questioning was seen as hostility. She saw his perspective clearly. He was in control of this stretch of road, and she was challenging that control. In his world, that couldn't stand. She took one more deep breath. The logical part of her brain won. Arguing on the side of this rainy road would lead nowhere good. She had to let this play out. She had to get to the other side of it. "All right," she said, the word tasting bitter. "I am stepping out, but I am doing so under protest. I do not believe this is lawful." She moved slowly. First, she put the car in park, though it already was. The click was loud. Then, with her left hand, she turned off the engine. She pulled the keys from the ignition and held them up clearly before placing them on the dashboard. Then, with both hands still visible, she used her right to undo her seatbelt. The click echoed the first dot. She opened the door and stepped out into the rain. It was colder than she expected, instantly soaking through the shoulders of her blouse. She stood beside her car, the open door between her and the officer. The streetlight above cast long, dramatic shadows. "Step away from the vehicle and put your hands on the roof," he instructed. She did as she was told, walking to the back of her car and placing her palms flat on the wet, cold metal of the trunk. The rain ran down her neck. She could see the distorted red and blue lights reflecting in the puddles on the asphalt dot. He approached from behind. "Do you have any weapons on you? Anything sharp?" "No, I do not," she said, her voice muffled against the car. He began a pat-down. His hands were firm, impersonal, moving quickly over her sides, her back, her legs. It was degrading, this feeling of being handled on the side of the road. She focused on a crack in the asphalt near her feet, on a single leaf stuck in the gutter. She detached herself, going to a place in her mind where she was just an observer, collecting details. He finished. "Turn around." She turned. He was holding a pair of handcuffs, the steel looking dull in the wet light. "Are you arresting me?" she asked, the cold from the car seeping into her bones. "For obstructing a police officer and refusing a lawful order," he said. "Now, turn back around and put your hands behind your back." For a fleeting second, a wave of pure, hot anger washed over her. She wanted to shout, to cite case law, to tell him exactly who he was making a mistake with. But she swallowed it. The time for that was not now. Now was about surviving the moment without giving him any real reason to escalate further. She turned and placed her hands behind her back. The cold metal of the cuffs snapped around her wrists, too tight. The bite of them was a shock, a physical confirmation of the surreal turn her evening had taken. The click was final. He guided her, one hand on her arm, toward the back of his patrol car. As they passed her open car door, she saw her briefcase, her purse, her jacket, her whole professional life, just sitting there in the rain. "My belongings," she said. "They'll be inventoried," he replied, his tone all business now. He opened the rear door of the police car, a hard plastic bench behind a thick plexiglass divider. It smelled of stale sweat, cheap cleaner, and wet Final Dot she had to duck to get in. He placed a hand on top of her head, a standard procedure, but it felt like an added indignity. She shuffled onto the bench. The door shut with a heavy, solid thunk. The sound sealed her in. Suddenly, the world was quiet. The rain was a distant patter on the roof. The world outside the window was blurred and distorted by the water-streaked glass and the metal grating. She watched as he went back to her car. He leaned in, gathering her purse and her briefcase. He didn't look through them, but he took them. He closed her car door, but didn't lock it. He just left it there, vulnerable on the side of the road. He put her things in the front passenger seat of his patrol car, then got behind the wheel. The engine growled to life. Through the divider, she saw him pick up his radio microphone. "Dispatch, this is Unit 7. I'm 1076 with one in custody for 501. Female. We're en route to the precinct." A crackled voice responded. "Copy that, Unit 7. He put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb. In the side mirror of the patrol car, she watched her own vehicle, dark and abandoned, get smaller and smaller until the rain and the night swallowed it up. She was alone in the back of a cage, her wrists aching, her clothes soaked, being taken to a place she only knew from the other side of a courtroom. The officer didn't speak to her. He drove in silence. She sat upright, refusing to slump. She looked out the window, memorizing the route. She noted the time. She focused on the details, the model of the radio, the number on his shoulder, the procedure he followed. The lawyer in her was already working, cutting through the shock and the humiliation, building a case from the inside of a police car. This wasn't over. It had only just begun. The ride to the precinct was short, maybe 10 minutes, but it felt like an hour. The world outside the rain-streaked window was a blur of dark streets and bright storefronts. She sat perfectly still in the back, her hands cuffed behind her, her back not touching the hard plastic seat. It was a small act of defiance, to not get comfortable in this space. The metal of the cuffs was cold and tight, and a dull ache was starting to settle into her shoulders. She watched the back of the officer's head. He drove with a relaxed kind of confidence, one hand on the wheel. He didn't look back at her, didn't speak. The radio crackled now and then with codes and voices she only half understood. The silence was its own kind of noise, loud and heavy. They pulled into a bay at the back of a low brick building. Crestwood Hills Police Department. The sign was neat, lit up under a canopy. The officer got out, opened her door, and guided her by the elbow. The rain had slowed to a mist, cold on her skin. The air smelled of wet asphalt and exhaust dot inside. The precinct was bright. Harsh fluorescent lights reflected off linoleum floors that had been cleaned one too many times. The air was warm and stuffy, carrying the smells of old coffee, cheap paper, and a faint chemical lemon scent. It was quieter than she expected. A younger officer sat behind a tall desk, typing slowly with 2 fingers. He glanced up, his eyes passing over her with a bored look before going back to his screen. Her arresting officer walked her up to the desk. "Got one for processing," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the space. The desk officer nodded, slid a clipboard over. "Fill out the arrest report." "I'll get her set up." She was led past the desk, down a short hallway to a small, cluttered room. This was the processing area. There was a digital camera on a tripod, a scanner for fingerprints, and a messy desk covered in forms, and a stained coffee mug. Another officer, a woman with tired eyes and her hair in a practical bun, was in charge here. "All right," the woman said, her voice flat. "Stand on the mark." She pointed to a yellow set of footprints, painted on the floor against a plain white wall. She stepped onto the marks. The camera flashed, once from the front, once from the side. A bright light left spots in her vision. She felt a heat in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the warm room. It was the heat of shame, of being catalogued like an object. "Now, right hand, please," the officer said, pointing to the fingerprint scanner. It was a small glass plate. The arresting officer finally removed the cuffs from behind her back. The rush of blood returning to her hands was a sharp, painful tingle. She flexed her fingers slowly, then placed her right hand on the glass, as instructed. A red light scanned beneath it. "Roll your fingers, one at a time." The officer guided her thumb, then each finger, rolling them to capture the print from every angle. Then the left hand. The process was cold, methodical, impersonal. She kept her face blank, but inside she was cataloging everything. The lack of privacy, the fact that no one had yet explained her rights or asked if she needed anything. "You have any medical conditions I should know about?" "On any medications?" the officer with the bun asked, not really looking at her. "No," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "Empty your pockets. Everything goes in the basket." She took out her phone, which had been on silent in her pocket. A tiny personal lifeline. She placed it in the plastic basket they provided. Her house keys, a tube of lip balm, a few crumpled receipts. It felt strangely violating to have these small pieces of her life laid out on a government-issue tray. The arresting officer was at the desk in the corner, filling out his paperwork. She could hear the scratch of his pen. He spoke without looking up. Obstruction, resisting, failure to comply with a lawful order during a traffic stop. Add that she was argumentative and suspicious from the get-go. The words floated over. Argumentative, suspicious. They were just words on a form, but they were the foundation of the story he was building. The story where he was the professional keeping order, and she was the problem that needed to be controlled. The processing officer took her basket of belongings and started writing a list on a yellow form. She picked up the phone. "I need to make my one phone call," she said clearly. The officer paused, looked at the arresting officer. He shrugged, still writing. "After booking. We're not done here." That was wrong. She knew it was wrong. They were supposed to allow it without unreasonable delay. But she bit her tongue. Arguing here, in this little room, would just add another note to his report. Continued to be uncooperative. The processing officer finished the list, handed her the basket back. "Hold on to this. You'll get a receipt in a minute." Then she pointed to a heavy metal door with a small, wire-reinforced window. "In there. Have a seat." The door buzzed loudly, a harsh electric sound, and the lock clunked open. The officer pulled it open. It was the holding cell. It was exactly like in the movies, but smaller and dingier. A concrete bench was bolted to the wall. A stainless steel toilet with no seat sat in the corner. The walls were a dull, sickly green, covered in scuffs and faint, indecipherable scratches. The floor was concrete. The air was cold and smelled of old bleach and something else. Something sour and human. The door clanged shut behind her. The sound was final, a heavy metallic echo that vibrated in her bones. The lock engaged with another solid clunk. Alone. For the first time since the red and blue lights had flashed, the full weight of it crashed down on her. The adrenaline that had been holding her up began to seep away, leaving her feeling hollow and shaky. She walked to the bench and sat down, not caring about the cold or the dirt. She placed the plastic basket with her few things beside her. She looked at her hands. They were trembling slightly. She clasped them together to make it stop. She focused on breathing in and out, slow and deep. The lawyer in her mind started shouting again, listing the violations. The unlawful order to exit, the arrest without probable cause, the denial of her phone call. But the human part of her just felt cold and small and terribly alone. She could hear voices from the other side of the door, muffled but clear enough. It was the arresting officer talking to the desk sergeant. Just another one who thinks the rules don't apply, he was saying, a note of satisfaction in his voice. Nice car, fancy neighborhood. Probably up to no good. Gave me a whole speech about her rights. You know the type. The sergeant grunted in response. Paperwork's clean? Clean as a whistle. She resisted. I had no choice. There was a pause, then the sound of a coffee machine gurgling. Let her sit for a bit. Cool her heels. The night court clerk won't be in for another hour anyway. She closed her eyes. The casualness of it was the worst part. This was just a Tuesday night for them. A minor nuisance, a paperwork chore. She was not a person with a job, a life, a mind full of case law. She was a type, a problem to be processed and stored. She thought of her briefcase, sitting in the front seat of that patrol car. Inside it was her state identification, her business cards with the official seal, the notes from the very case about systemic injustice she had been working on all day. The irony was so bitter, it almost made her laugh. A choked sound that died in her throat. Time stretched. She listened to the distant sounds of the precinct. A phone ringing, a chair squeaking, the low murmur of talk. Every minute in the cold, silent cell was a minute her professional self was locked away, and a new, raw understanding was growing in its place. This was what it felt like. This was the helplessness. This was the system grinding away, impersonal and sure. She wasn't just a lawyer anymore. She was a witness. And she was collecting evidence not from files, but from the cold bench beneath her, the tight feeling in her chest, and the echo of a cop's dismissive voice in the hall. The case was no longer abstract. It was happening right here, to her. And she knew, with a cold certainty, that if this could happen to her, in her suit, with her knowledge, it could happen to anyone. The fight had left the conference room and followed her into this cell. And now it was personal. The cold from the concrete bench had seeped through her clothes, becoming a deep, dull ache. She had lost track of time. It could have been 20 minutes or an hour. The silence in the holding cell was broken only by the distant, muffled sounds of the precinct, the occasional ringing phone, a burst of static from a radio, the low hum of the fluorescent lights in the ceiling outside her door. She sat with her back straight, her hands in her lap. The initial shock had hardened into a kind of grim resolve. Her mind, a lawyer's mind, was now running on a clear, cold track. She was cataloging every detail. The exact wording the officer had used, the temperature in the processing room, the bored look on the desk sergeant's face. She was building a timeline. She was noting every procedural misstep. It was the only way to keep the helplessness at bay, to turn herself from a prisoner into an investigator. Outside, in the main booking area, The night shift sergeant was reviewing the paperwork that had just landed on her desk. It was a slow Tuesday. She sipped from a mug of tea that had gone lukewarm. She was a woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, her hair shot through with gray, and her eyes that had seen too many long nights. She preferred order. Paperwork needed to be right. She picked up the arrest report from the officer. It was fairly standard, a traffic stop that escalated due to non-compliance. She read the narrative he'd written. The subject displayed a defensive and argumentative posture from the initial contact, refused a lawful order to exit the vehicle, continued to question authority necessitating arrest for obstruction. The sergeant's eyes skinned down to the personal details section. Name, address, date of birth. She took another sip of tea, about to set it aside and start the file for the night court clerk. But something made her pause. The name. It had a faint ring of familiarity, a tiny bell in the back of her memory. It wasn't a common name. She frowned, tapping her finger on the paper. Where had she heard it? Not from a local blotter. It was something else, something official. She swiveled in her chair toward the computer terminal on her desk. With a few clicks, she bypassed the local police database and went to the broader state professional licensing portal. It was a tool they sometimes used to verify professions. She typed in the name from the arrest report. The search took a second. Then the results popped up. The sergeant's breath caught in her throat. She leaned forward, her eyes widening slightly as she read the screen. There was a photo, a professional headshot. It was her, the woman in the holding cell. But the title beneath the name wasn't suspect or defendant. It read, **** Assistant Attorney General, Civil Rights Division, ****. For a few seconds, the sergeant just stared. A cold feeling, entirely different from the chill of the cell, spread through her stomach. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a catastrophe waiting to happen. Her mind raced through the implications, the lawsuit, the media, the internal investigation, the sheer, monumental professional disgrace. She stood up so quickly, her chair rolled back and hit the filing cabinet behind her with a loud thud. The sound echoed in the quiet room. The arresting officer was by the coffee maker, laughing softly with the processing officer about a game that was on TV later. He looked over, curious. The sergeant's face was pale, her expression tight. She didn't look at him. She walked quickly, almost running, around the desk and down the short hall toward the holding cells. Her sensible shoes made sharp clicks on the linoleum. The officer watched her go, his smile fading. "Sarge, everything all right?" She didn't answer. She reached the heavy metal door. Her hand, which usually moved with deliberate slowness, fumbled with the keys on her belt. She found the right one, jammed it into the lock, and turned it. The loud clunk of the lock disengaging was the first sound from the door in what felt like an eternity to the woman. Inside, the door swung open. The sergeant stood in the doorway, her frame blocking the light from the hall. The woman on the bench looked up, her expression carefully neutral, prepared for the next step in the process. What she saw instead was the sergeant's face, mixture of profound apology and sheer panic. The professional mask was completely gone. "Miss Thorne?" the sergeant said, her voice uncharacteristically soft, almost trembling. "I am so very sorry. There has been a terrible, terrible mistake." The words hung in the cold air. The woman Maya said nothing. She simply looked at the sergeant, her eyes taking in every detail of the woman's distress. This was a piece of evidence she hadn't expected. The sergeant stepped fully into the cell, which felt wrong, like a warden entering a prisoner's space not to command, but to beg. "Please, come with me. Right now. You shouldn't be in here. This should never have happened." Maya stood up slowly. Her muscles were stiff from the cold and from sitting so still. She picked up the plastic basket holding her phone and keys. She didn't smile. She didn't nod. She just followed the sergeant out of the cell, back into the bright, fluorescent light of the hallway. As they emerged into the main booking area, the scene was frozen. The processing officer had stopped what she was doing. The desk officer was staring, and the arresting officer was still by the coffee maker, holding his full mug. He saw his sergeant emerging from the cell block, with the detainee following calmly behind, no longer in cuffs, carrying her property basket. A confused, slightly amused grin touched his lips. Maybe the sergeant had talked some sense into her. Maybe she'd finally copped an attitude adjustment. "Don't worry, Sarge," he called out, his voice loud and confident in the quiet room. He took a step forward. She'd be singing a different tune after a night in holding. They all do. He didn't understand the silence that followed his words. He didn't understand why the processing officer suddenly looked down at her shoes, why the desk sergeant's face went from pale to ashen. The sergeant turned to look at him. The look in her eyes wasn't anger. It was something worse. It was pity and dread. And then the sergeant turned back to Maya. "Again, my deepest apologies, ma'am. Is there anything I can get for you? Some water? Would you like to use a private office?" The officer by the coffee maker blinked. Ma'am? The mug felt suddenly very heavy in his hand. His eyes darted from his sergeant's deferential posture to the woman she was addressing. The woman was just standing there, calm, quiet, watching him. Her hair was a little messy from the rain and the pat-down. Her clothes were wrinkled. But she stood with an authority that had nothing to do with handcuffs or uniforms. It was the quiet, unmovable authority of someone who held the power of the state in her hands, and who had just been profoundly wronged. The penny dropped. It didn't just drop. It crashed through the floor. He saw the briefcase, now sitting on the sergeant's desk. He saw the state seal on the identification folder the sergeant must have found inside. He remembered the confident way she had spoken about the law on the side of the road. It wasn't bluff. It wasn't attitude. It was her job. His mouth went dry. The confident grin vanished, leaving his face slack and empty. The hot coffee in the mug burned his hand, but he didn't feel it. All he felt was the bottomless pit opening up beneath his feet. This wasn't a routine arrest anymore. This was the end of his career. Possibly the start of a lawsuit. Definitely the start of a nightmare. He stood there, paralyzed, as the sergeant gently guided the attorney toward a side office, speaking in low, urgent tones of apology. The processing officer suddenly found urgent paperwork to file. The desk officer busied himself with the phone. No one looked at him. He was alone in the middle of the room, holding a cooling mug of coffee, staring at the empty space where the woman from the cell had just been standing. The only sound was the quiet click of the office door shutting behind her, and the deafening roar of his own panic filling his head. The private office was small, cluttered with old case files and a wilting peace lily on the filing cabinet. The sergeant offered her the only comfortable chair, a worn leather one behind the desk. She declined, preferring to stand by the window. The sergeant hovered, a bundle of nervous energy. "Can I get your things?" "Your briefcase? A coffee, perhaps?" The sergeant asked, her voice still tight with apology. "My briefcase and purse, please." "And a glass of water would be fine," she said. Her voice was calm. It was not the calm of forgiveness, but the calm of deep, still water. The kind that runs very, very deep. The sergeant scurried out and returned a moment later with her leather briefcase, her purse, and a paper cup of cold water. She placed them on the desk with great care, as if they were fragile artifacts. "Ma'am, on behalf of the Crestwood Hills Police Department, I cannot apologize enough for this profound error in judgment. The officer involved will be placed on administrative leave immediately, pending a full internal review. Charges, of course, have been dropped. Your record is being cleared as we speak." She took a slow sip of the water. It tasted like the paper cup. She placed it down. "I would like my phone call now, Sergeant." The sergeant blinked. "Oh, of course. Yes, you can use this phone? Absolutely. I'll give you complete privacy." She backed out of the room, closing the door softly behind her. Alone. She finally picked up her phone from the property basket. The screen showed several missed calls from a colleague and 2 from her sister. She didn't dial them. Instead, she scrolled to a number labeled Office Direct. She pressed call. It was answered on the second ring. "Civil Rights Division?" "It's me," she said. Her voice, for the first time since the stop, wavered just a fraction. She cleared her throat. "I need you to listen, and I need you to not ask questions until I'm finished." She then proceeded, in clear, concise paragraphs, to recount the events. The stop, the unlawful order, the arrest, the processing, the denial of her call, the comments overheard. She gave names, badge numbers, times. She spoke like she was dictating the most important brief of her life. On the other end of the line, there was a stunned silence, followed by a low, steady stream of quiet, professional fury. "Are you safe now?" "Where are you?" "I am physically safe. I am at the Crestwood Hills precinct. They have just realized who I am. The apologies have begun. Don't say another word to anyone. Not a word. We are on our way. Do not accept a ride home from them. Do not sign anything. Just wait." "I understand," she said, and hung up. She stood by the window, looking out at the parking lot. The rain had stopped. The world looked washed clean, but she felt stained by the experience. She saw her officer walk out of the building. He wasn't wearing his duty belt. He was carrying a small box. He walked to his personal car, got in, and just sat there, his head in his hands. She watched, feeling nothing but a cold, analytical distance. That man was now a subject of an investigation. He was no longer a threat. He was evidence. About 20 minutes later, 2 cars pulled into the lot with purpose. One was a sleek sedan. Out of it stepped 2 of her colleagues from the Attorney General's office. One of them the division chief himself, a man with a reputation for being a quiet storm. The other car was driven by a junior associate who carried a fresh suit garment bag. The sergeant, seeing them through the front glass, nearly tripped over herself to open the door. The division chief did not offer his hand. He simply said, "Where is she?" She was brought out to the front. Seeing her colleagues, her people, was the first moment the professional armor she'd worn all night showed a crack. Her eyes glistened, but she did not cry. The junior associate handed her the garment bag. "The restroom is here," the sergeant said meekly, pointing in the clean, tiled bathroom. She changed out of her wrinkled, rain-dampened blouse and into the fresh suit jacket and blouse from the bag. She washed her face, ran wet fingers through her hair, and looked in the mirror. She looked tired, but she also looked like herself again. The Assistant Attorney General. She squared her shoulders. When she walked back out, transformed, the energy in the precinct had shifted entirely. Her team was a wall of quiet, formidable power. The division chief was speaking in a low, lethal tone to the sergeant. Full preservation of all evidence. Body cam footage, dash cam, all reports written and deleted, the arrest log. Consider this department served with notice. She collected her briefcase. She looked at the sergeant. "I will be recusing myself from any direct personal litigation that may arise from this," she said, her voice clear in the silent room. Every officer present was listening. "But this matter will be reviewed by the Civil Rights Division with the full rigor of the law. You can expect formal contact within the week." They left the precinct. No one said, "Have a nice night." The door shut behind them with a soft swish, a world away from the clang of the cell door dot in the car. Her division chief finally asked, "Are you okay?" She looked out the window at the passing streetlights. "No," she said honestly, "but I will be. And we have work to do." The next few days were a whirlwind of a different kind. The internal affairs investigation at the police department was swift and severe. The officer was not just suspended. He was terminated. The district attorney's office, wanting to get ahead of the tidal wave, announced a review of his past arrests. The story, of course, leaked to the press. It was front-page news. State attorney detained in alleged racial profiling incident. The police chief held a stuttering press conference, promising reform. But for her, the public spectacle was just noise. The real work was in the quiet of her office, now with a team of investigators. They pulled every traffic stop record from Crestwood Hills for the past 5 years. They ran the data. They looked for patterns. The single incident was bad, but it was just a symptom. She was after the disease. Weeks later, she stood before a state legislative committee in a packed hearing room. Cameras flashed. She wore a simple, dark suit. Her voice did not shake. She did not shout. She presented the data in clean, clear charts. The disproportionate stops. The higher rate of searches for minority drivers. The lack of follow-up on complaints. She never mentioned her own experience. She didn't have to. Everyone in the room knew. It hung in the air, giving weight to every statistic, every dry legal point. The evidence suggests not just the failing of an individual, she concluded, looking directly at the lawmakers, but the failing of a system. A system that allowed bias to go unchecked, that rewarded certain outcomes, that viewed entire communities with suspicion instead of seeing them as citizens deserving of equal protection. That system must be examined, and it must be changed. As she gathered her papers, the chairman thanked her. A reporter shouted a question about the officer who had arrested her. She paused, then offered the only personal comment she would make. "That traffic stop was the worst night of my professional life," she said, meeting the reporter's eye. "But for him, I suspect it was just a Tuesday. That is the problem we are here to solve." She walked out of the hearing room, her team flanking her. The work was far from over. There would be negotiations, consent decrees, years of monitoring. But a line had been drawn. The officer's decision on a rainy night hadn't just backfired on him. It had turned a spotlight on a dark corner, and the woman he tried to detain was the one holding the light, steady and unwavering. The real case, the most important one of her career, had finally begun.